There are moments in life when a single look changes everything. This was one of those moments. Have you ever felt that invisible presence that seems to touch your soul when you least expect it? That is exactly what happened that afternoon in Hollywood, when two men met for the first time, without knowing that the universe was conspiring to create one of the most transformative moments in spiritual cinema. The Californian sun was casting its final rays over the office where Mel Gibson waited. An uneasy man, Gibson held in his hands a screenplay that no one wanted to produce. It wasn't just any film. It was the most told story of all time, but narrated in a way no one had dared to tell before. And now, he needed to find someone who could embody not just a character, but a presence that transcended 2 millennia of human history. Can you imagine the weight of that decision? To choose the one who would face the divine? How does one recognize a soul capable of conveying infinite compassion through a movie screen? The clock struck exactly 4:32 p.m. when the door opened. Jim Caviezel entered with calm, almost hesitant steps. He was not the type of actor to command a room upon arrival. His presence was different, almost imperceptible at first glance. Yet there was something there, something that Gibson sensed even before he consciously noticed it. "Please have a seat." Gibson gestured, carefully observing every movement of the 33-year-old man, the same age traditionally attributed to Jesus at the moment of his crucifixion. A coincidence that Gibson would only realize weeks later. The initial conversation was trivial. Questions about career, expectations, availability. But then something changed. Gibson asked a seemingly simple question. "Why do you think you are here today?" It was at that moment that everything shifted. Caviezel looked directly into Gibson's eyes, and time seemed to suspend its natural flow. Later in interviews, Gibson would try to explain that instant, but the words would always seem inadequate to capture the essence of what he felt. It was as if an inner light was ignited. He would say months later, "It wasn't a physical effect, there was something in his gaze, something coming from a deep place." Have you ever encountered eyes like those? Eyes that seem to see beyond appearances, reflecting not only the light of the surroundings, but something older, wiser, almost timeless? Gibson's breath caught in his throat as Caviezel replied with simple words, "I'm here because I need to be." It wasn't arrogance, it was a quiet, almost resigned certainty. In that office, with a view of the city of fabricated dreams, something was occurring that no camera could adequately capture. A mutual recognition that transcended contracts and auditions. Gibson felt a shiver run down his spine as an inexplicable certainty took hold. This man possessed something rare, something that couldn't be taught in acting schools. The interview continued for another hour, but the decision had been made within the first 5 minutes of that encounter. Something had been sealed there, a silent promise between two men who did not yet fully understand the path they were about to embark on together. When Caviezel finally rose to leave, Gibson remained seated, watching him walk to the door. It was then that he noticed. The evening light formed a subtle halo around the actor's silhouette, a trick of the Californian light, or something more. Years later, Gibson would still wonder about that moment. And what about you? If you were in that room, what would you have seen in Jim Caviezel's eyes? The coffee was growing cold in its cup while Gibson gazed out the window of his private office. 3 days had passed since that encounter, yet the impression remained vivid, almost tangible. There was something ineffable in those eyes, something that could not be defined in words, yet resonated deeply. You must understand that Gibson was not merely searching for a talented actor. Hollywood is full of them. He was looking for something far rarer, someone with the capacity to disappear completely into a role that transcends mere performance. Someone who could bear the weight of the most transformative story ever told without breaking under its magnitude. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. On the other line, his assistant informed him that Caviezel had arrived for the second conversation. When Caviezel entered the room this time, Gibson was ready to observe him even more closely. Not just the professional, but the man. What was it about him that evoked that unusual sensation? "Do you have any idea what we are about to do?" Gibson asked bluntly, studying Caviezel's reaction. The answer came with a clarity that once again struck Gibson like a silent wave. "We aren't just making a movie. We are touching something sacred." That was precisely it. It wasn't a rehearsed line or a calculated remark meant to impress. It was the natural expression of someone who understood that the project was not merely a career opportunity, but a spiritual responsibility. Gibson watched as Caviezel spoke with his hands, measured gestures that were nonetheless expressive. How his voice shifted tone when delving into deeper subjects. How his eyes, those eyes seemed to carry an ancient sadness along with profound compassion. "Are you afraid?" Gibson suddenly asked. Caviezel smiled, a smile that didn't quite light up his eyes, leaving behind a shadow of knowing. "Yes, I am. But it isn't the kind of fear that makes you retreat. It's the kind that makes you advance with greater reverence." At that moment, Gibson understood part of what he had seen in that first meeting. It wasn't merely intensity. Many actors possess that. It was a rare quality, genuine vulnerability combined with an unshakable inner strength. Can you imagine this paradox? The coexistence of human fragility with an almost superhuman determination. It is a combination you rarely encounter, but when you do, you recognize it immediately. As they discussed the practical aspects of the film, Gibson couldn't help but notice how natural light seemed to interact differently with Caviezel. It wasn't a dramatic effect. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the light found in him a unique reflective quality, especially in his eyes. "There's something you need to understand," Gibson finally said. "This film will demand more than just acting. It will demand total surrender." Caviezel simply nodded, as if he had known that long before the conversation. When the meeting ended, Gibson remained seated, absorbing the ensuing silence. An inner conviction was growing within him, not an intellectual certainty, but a visceral understanding. What he had seen in Caviezel's eyes was a rare openness, not merely the ability to perform a role, but to serve as a conduit for something greater than himself. And isn't that what the story demanded? Wasn't that precisely what defined the central character of that age-old narrative? The willingness to be a vessel for something transcendent? That night, alone in his studio, Gibson picked up a pencil and wrote a single sentence in his journal. In his eyes, I saw someone willing to disappear so that another may be seen. And you? Have you ever met someone with that rare quality? Someone whose eyes revealed a soul willing to become transparent so that something greater might shine through? The news spread through Hollywood like a whisper. Mel Gibson had found his Jesus. But while the industry speculated about commercial aspects and artistic risks, few knew what truly guided that choice. Understand the context. Gibson was investing his own fortune in a project many considered commercially suicidal, a film about the Passion of Christ in Aramaic and Latin, with subtitles, portraying with visceral realism the final hours of Jesus. Hollywood executives had rejected it one by one. "Who's going to watch this?" they asked, not understanding that Gibson was not merely seeking an audience, but an encounter. During the first table read with the main cast, something remarkable happened. Gibson observed from a distance as Caviezel delivered his first lines. The actor had spent weeks studying Aramaic, absorbing not just the pronunciation, but the rhythm and cadence of the language. When his voice filled the room, something in the atmosphere changed. It was as if the air had become denser, recounted an actress present later. It wasn't just Jim reading lines from a script. It was as if a presence had entered the room. Gibson felt that familiar shiver again. It was not superstition, it was recognition. As preparations advanced, Gibson began to notice changes in Caviezel. The actor had always been reserved, but now he seemed to carry a different quietude. During breaks, while others chatted animatedly, he often withdrew, seeking moments of solitude as if he had to preserve something fragile inside him. On one such occasion, Gibson found him sitting alone, gazing at the horizon. "May I join you?" Gibson asked. Caviezel simply nodded, without turning his eyes from the distant line where the sky met the earth. For several minutes, they remained in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but a full one, as if words were inadequate for what was unfolding. "You're changing, aren't you?" Gibson finally asked. Caviezel slowly turned, and there they were again, those eyes, but now different, deeper, as if they had retreated to a more inward place. "I'm not just portraying him," Caviezel answered in an almost inaudible voice. "I'm allowing him to portray me." Have you ever experienced that rare moment when words seem to come from somewhere beyond the intellect? When someone expresses a truth so pure that it resonates like a clear bell in a silent morning. Gibson did not reply immediately. What could one say in the face of such a revelation? He was witnessing something that transcended the usual methods of an actor's preparation. It was like watching a gradual transfiguration, day after day. "Be careful," Gibson finally said. "Don't lose yourself completely." Caviezel smiled. That smile Gibson now recognized as characteristic, a blend of kindness and ancient knowledge. Perhaps finding yourself and losing yourself are the same thing, just seen from different angles. As the sun descended on the horizon, casting long shadows over the two men sitting silently, Gibson understood that he was witnessing something extraordinarily rare. An actor who was not merely playing a role, but allowing the role to transform him from within. In the days that followed, the crew began to notice subtle changes in their behavior around Caviezel. Seasoned technicians, accustomed to treating actors with professional familiarity, started displaying an almost unconscious deference. It was not imposed or acted. It emerged naturally, like water finding its own level. "It's strange," remarked a veteran camera operator with years of experience. "When he's on set, even before we begin filming, I feel like I should, I don't know, behave better." And you? Have you ever been in the presence of someone who, without any apparent effort, brings out the best in you simply by being there? What Gibson saw now went beyond that first look which had captivated him. It was the living manifestation of what those eyes had promised, a surrender that transcended the conventional understanding of acting and entered into the sacred realm of artistic embodiment. On the eve of the first shooting days, Gibson found on his desk a small handwritten note from Caviezel. "I'm not the one who carries the cross. It is the cross that carries me." The filming set, located in the barren hills of Matera, Italy, was enveloped in a thin mist that morning. The technical crew moved with a quiet efficiency, unusual for a film production where loud voices and repeated commands are the norm. Can you feel the tension in the air? That silent electricity that precedes moments of deep meaning? Gibson stayed apart, observing the final preparations for one of the film's most significant scenes. Caviezel had been in his makeup tent for over 3 hours. The process of physical transformation was exhausting. The elaborate makeup, the prosthetics, the hair, and most notably, the crown. When the tent door finally opened, a strange silence fell over the set. It wasn't planned or orchestrated. It was involuntary, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. Caviezel emerged slowly, now completely transformed. But it wasn't just the impressive makeup, the simulated wounds, or the meticulously researched costume that created such an impact. It was something more. From his vantage point, Gibson felt a lump form in his throat. There it was, the very thing he had glimpsed in Caviezel's eyes during that first interview, now fully manifested. A veteran technician dropped a piece of equipment. An extra began to cry softly. These were not reactions to the performance. They were responses to a presence emanating from Caviezel in almost tangible waves. When Caviezel finally lifted his gaze and met Gibson's eyes across the set, the director understood what he was witnessing. This was not just an actor in a role. It was someone who had allowed his identity to become temporarily translucent so that another presence could inhabit the space. "Quiet on set," announced the assistant director in a strangely measured tone. That morning scene, one of the film's most intense, was captured in a single, uninterrupted take. Not because it was technically perfect, but because it possessed a quality that no one dared to interrupt with a cut, and let's do it again. Have you ever experienced a moment of such perfection that you instinctively felt trying to recreate it would be a form of desecration? During lunch, Gibson noticed that Caviezel hadn't joined the rest of the crew. He found him alone, still partially in makeup, sitting on a rock, looking out over the valley below. "How are you feeling?" Gibson asked, sensing that common words were insufficient. Caviezel did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "It's like being in two places at the same time, inside and outside, present and absent." Gibson simply nodded, understanding that he was in the presence of an experience for which conventional vocabulary was inadequate. "What do you see when you look in the mirror?" Gibson asked after a long silence. Caviezel smiled, that smile that now seemed to carry centuries of wisdom. I no longer look at myself in the mirror during filming, he replied simply. As the weeks passed, stories began to circulate among the crew. Tales of inexplicable events on set, lights that mysteriously shifted during crucial scenes, equipment that picked up sounds not present in the environment, and moments when the temperature seemed to change drastically without apparent cause. An experienced cameraman, known for his pragmatic skepticism, confided to Gibson, "I've filmed on nearly every continent, worked on over 50 productions, but I've never seen anything like this. It's as if the camera is capturing more than the eye can perceive." Gibson kept these stories to himself, neither confirming nor denying them. But deep down, he knew that something extraordinary was unfolding, something that defied conventional explanation. One afternoon, after a particularly intense sequence, Gibson found Caviezel sitting alone once again, his hands trembling slightly. "Sometimes," Caviezel began, his voice choked, "sometimes I feel as though I'm not the one who decides how a scene unfolds, as if I were being guided." Gibson nodded, unsurprised. He had noticed how Caviezel often diverged subtly from the script, not out of rebellion, but as though responding to an inner direction more compelling than the written words. "Trust that," Gibson simply replied. "Trust that guidance." What Gibson was witnessing was the central mystery of great art, the moment when the artist becomes a channel for something larger than his own imagination or technical skill. When the boundary between creator and creation dissolves into a dance of co-participation with something transcendent. And you, have you ever had moments in your life when you felt that something greater was flowing through you? When your actions seemed to be guided by a wisdom that exceeded your conscious understanding? That night, alone in his hotel room, Gibson wrote in his journal, "What I saw today in his eyes was not acting. It was revelation." The small medieval church near the set remained open through the night. Gibson discovered it by chance during a walk to clear his mind after an especially challenging day of shooting. Do you know that feeling of entering an ancient sacred space? The silence that seems to be alive, almost palpable, as if centuries of prayers had solidified in the very air? It was in that space that Gibson found Caviezel sitting alone, illuminated only by the flickering light of a few candles. He was not in costume. The filming had ended hours earlier, but there was something in his posture that made Gibson hesitate to approach, as if he were witnessing something intimate and sacred. Caviezel was not praying, at least not in any overt way. He was simply sitting, looking at the simple altar with an expression that Gibson couldn't entirely decipher. A blend of reverence, gratitude, and something else, a knowledge that seemed to go beyond personal experience. Gibson quietly stepped back, feeling like an intruder. But before he could leave, Caviezel spoke without turning his head. "You're transforming all of us, aren't you?" Gibson stopped, surprised to be noticed despite his silence. "Yes," he replied simply, moving closer and taking a seat on the bench next to Caviezel. For several minutes, they simply remained there, sharing that ancient silence. "Do you know what's most strange?" Caviezel finally asked, his voice echoing softly off the stone walls. "It's not how much this is changing me, but how it is revealing who I've always been." Gibson looked at him, intrigued. "It's as if," Caviezel continued, searching for the right words, "as if this role were peeling away layers rather than adding them. As if, to truly portray him, I had to become more authentically myself." In that moment, sitting in the half-light of that secular church, Gibson understood something fundamental about what he had seen in Caviezel's eyes from that first meeting. It wasn't merely intensity or exceptional talent. It was an authenticity so rare that it almost seemed luminous. "I think that's why I chose you," Gibson admitted. "Not for your ability to transform into another person, but for your willingness to reveal your truest essence." Caviezel smiled, that familiar smile which now illuminated his eyes in a way that seemed to come from deep within. "Do you understand now why I'm grateful?" Caviezel asked, not just for the professional opportunity, but for the personal journey. As filming progressed, Gibson began to notice changes not just in Caviezel, but throughout the entire crew. Technicians who normally treated their work as just a job now exhibited an almost reverent attention to detail. Supporting actors reported profound experiences during their scenes. Even the most skeptical seemed touched by a kind of silent awe. A particularly notable phenomenon began to occur. During breaks in filming, local people, farmers, elderly residents from nearby towns, children, quietly appeared at the edges of the set, not to see celebrities or the spectacle of a film production, but simply to observe Caviezel from a distance. "It's as if they feel something," commented a production assistant. "They don't even know who he is as an actor, yet something draws them." On one especially hot afternoon, an elderly woman managed to pass the security and approach Caviezel between scenes. Without uttering a word, she simply took his hand and pressed it to her lips, her eyes full of tears. Then she quietly withdrew, asking for neither autographs nor photos. Gibson watched the scene from afar, feeling an emotion he could not quite name. What was it that that woman had seen? The same as what he saw in that first Hollywood encounter? That night, he found Caviezel sitting on the edge of a cliff, gazing at the lights of the small town below. "How do you cope with this?" Gibson asked, sitting beside him. "With the way people respond to you?" Caviezel remained silent for a long moment. "They're not responding to me," he finally said. "They're responding to something I'm channeling momentarily." "And you? Have you ever felt as though you were momentarily a conduit for something greater than yourself? As if your everyday self had stepped aside to let something more luminous shine through?" As the sky darkened and the first stars emerged, Gibson realized he was witnessing not just the creation of a film, but a sort of collective pilgrimage, a journey that was leaving indelible marks on everyone involved. "What do you think will be different when we're done?" Gibson asked. Caviezel turned toward him, his eyes reflecting the starlight above. "Everything," he replied simply. "And nothing, as always happens when we encounter something true." The final scene was filmed at a September dawn. A golden light bathed the hills as the crew gathered for the concluding moment of that extraordinary journey. Have you ever experienced those rare moments when time seems to expand and contract simultaneously? When every second carries the weight of eternity, yet hours seem to pass in an instant. Gibson remained in the background, allowing his assistant director to handle the final technical details. However, his eyes never left Caviezel, who was already in position, awaiting the command. When the assistant finally shouted action, something extraordinary occurred. A cloud that had partially obscured the sun suddenly moved, bathing the set in a light so intense it briefly blinded the crew. At the same time, a complete silence fell over the place, not merely an absence of dialogue, but a quietude that seemed to absorb even the ambient sounds. The scene unfolded in one flawless take. When the assistant finally declared cut, no one moved for several seconds, as if everyone was slowly awakening from a collective dream. Gibson stepped toward Caviezel, who remained motionless, his eyes closed. "It's over," Gibson said softly. Caviezel slowly opened his eyes, and Gibson saw something that left him speechless. Those very eyes that had captivated him in their first meeting now seemed to contain entire universes of experience, as if they had witnessed the birth and death of stars, the suffering and redemption of countless eras. "No, it isn't over," Caviezel replied in an almost inaudible voice. "It has only just begun." That night, the crew gathered for a modest celebration. There was music, food, and wine, but an atmosphere unusual for a typical wrap party. It was not the exuberance of relief after months of hard work. It was something more reflective, almost solemn. Gibson watched from afar as crew members approached Caviezel one by one, not to request autographs or exchange jokes, but for simple moments of human contact, a handshake, an embrace, sometimes merely a shared look of mutual understanding. A veteran lighting technician, known for his gruff demeanor, approached Gibson with a glass of wine. 40 years in this business," he said in a hoarse voice filled with emotion, "and I've never seen or felt anything like this." Gibson only nodded, fully comprehending what the man meant. Later, as the celebration dwindled, Gibson found Caviezel sitting alone beneath the centuries-old olive tree. "What will you take from all this?" Gibson asked, sitting down next to him. Caviezel remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Do you remember our first conversation?" he finally asked. "When you inquired if I had any idea about what we were setting out to do?" Gibson nodded. "I thought I knew," Caviezel continued, "but I had no idea. None of us did. And now I understand that some stories aren't just told, they are relived. And in that process, they speak to us. Gibson reflected on those words, feeling their truth resonate deeply. What they had created was not merely a film, but a living experience that had transformed everyone involved. You know what impresses me the most? Gibson asked after a long silence. Caviezel turned to him, his eyes reflecting starlight. The fact that I recognized something in you that very first day. Gibson continued. Something that, I now understand, had always been there, waiting for the right moment to fully manifest. Caviezel smiled. That smile Gibson now knew so well, one that carried as much understanding as it did compassion. Perhaps it is the same for all of us, Caviezel replied. Maybe we all carry within a light waiting for the perfect moment and circumstance to shine. And you? Have you ever wondered which parts of your true self are still waiting for the right moment to manifest? What dormant qualities inside you are only waiting for the proper calling? Weeks later, when Gibson watched the first complete cut of the film in a dark, silent screening room, he finally comprehended the totality of what he had seen in Jim Caviezel's eyes in that first encounter. It wasn't merely exceptional artistic talent or profound spiritual devotion. It was a fundamental human quality that transcended all categories. The ability to become entirely transparent so that something more essential could be seen through. When the film was finally released, provoking intense reactions around the world, many critics and viewers commented on Caviezel's magnetic presence and transcendent performance. But for Gibson, who had witnessed the complete journey, it wasn't acting, it was revelation. What Mel Gibson saw in Jim Caviezel's eyes that afternoon in Hollywood was not just the potential for a great role. It was the recognition of a soul willing to undertake the most challenging journey an artist can face. The journey of becoming invisible so that something more essential might become visible. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of this story. Our greatest contribution may not be what we create by our own will and effort, but what we allow to flow through us when we become translucent in the light of a higher truth. When you look into someone else's eyes, what do you really see? And when you look in your own mirror, can you catch a glimpse of that inner light waiting to shine through?